Hello, hello, hello. Thanks for tuning in to Working Musicians. I'm your host, Dris Organica. Today, I'm going to be talking about mixers and why you just might want one or need one. I'd also like to thank Doers for helping make this episode possible. All right, so most of us know what a typical analog mixer looks like, whether it be some of the huge consoles you've seen in venues or in studios, or some of the more small things you've seen out and about. But it's funny how something that seems like such an obvious thing that we should need is just kind of sort of phasing out more and more so, primarily in the home studio use. But there's still a very relevant, very viable piece of hardware that I just can't imagine going away. And in fact, they keep on evolving and changing more so in the last 10 years than I think they had in the previous 30. But there's a few reasons in particular why I think a lot of people would like to have a mixer, but they don't really realize it yet. I think a lot of times people are getting around not having one, but if they were to have the tool at hand, they would find them very, very useful. So I think one of the obvious things is in the live arena, I mean, they're not going away anytime soon. While they seem to be going digital, now there's more wireless options out there. I'm not really going to get into all that because this isn't really so much about the how mixers work. It's more so the why you would need one. And especially if you're playing live shows, obviously mixers are needed. One thing to take into consideration is when I first started out playing original music, I didn't have a mixer. Thought about getting one, but everywhere we seemed to play had a mixer and a PA system, so it just wasn't necessary. But at the same time, looking back, it really kind of limited the kinds of places that we could play. Obviously, a mixer is just one part of the live sound equation, but without a mixer, it's kind of hard to plug all your stuff in and have it broadcasted out over speakers. So, I mean, obviously, if you're going to be serious about playing music, especially if you're doing covers, which is really where I think most people in the live scene who are making money are largely doing covers, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's a great way to make money. I know a lot of people who make their living off doing covers, in addition to some other freelance work, but they make a pretty good amount of money considering how much work they actually do in a week. Not to say that there's not a lot of work that goes into learning the songs and being prepared, and how the lifestyle can be kind of draining, considering you'll mostly be working weekends and late nights. But nonetheless, it's one of those things where, especially if you're in a cover band, you really have to have a mixer in addition to a PA system. I think that's kind of an obvious thing because obviously you need something to plug in all your mics and instruments into, and then from there be able to route them to your speakers or your front of house speakers so that people can actually hear what you're doing. But that's kind of an obvious thing. I don't think it's really necessary to get too far involved in that. It's just one of those things where you only need as big of a mixer as is necessary, whether you choose to go the route of a powered mixer, which is primarily a live sound tool, or whether you just go a standalone mixer using a power amp and speakers or self-powered speakers. At that point, you just need as big of a mixer as is necessary to be able to handle all the inputs and everything you need it to do. So now that we've kind of gotten that out of the way, let's talk about where you might need it in like your rehearsal space, for example, and also in the studio, of course. So in rehearsal spaces, it could be said that it's not necessarily a priority to have a mixer, and there's a lot to be said about that, because if you've got some way to amplify a microphone, people can hear the singer, but you still have to have some kind of speakers or something to plug that into. And so if you're going to do that, you might as well just have a mixer and just make your life a little bit easier. But in addition to that, in your rehearsal space, it's kind of nice to be able to record what you're doing, especially if you're writing songs, so that you have something to just quickly record and then be able to listen back to. Even if all you do is put a microphone in the middle of the room, that's fine, but a mixer makes that a little bit easier. But something else that's a kind of a nice thing to be able to do is, if it's one of those things where everybody's traveling to go to a rehearsal space, it's not always practical to go bring your half stack and your bass rig to every single practice, If all you have to do is bring either a small combo amp practice amp, so to speak, and your instrument and a cable or two, makes life a lot easier. So at that point, if you've already got a mixer and a PA system, all that you have to do is just bring, a small practice amp, or if you're a bass player, DI, or heck, if you really want to, you could use your, Pod Farm or your virtual guitar amp simulator, or even just a small little kid version look-alike thing of a digital drum set, and you can rehearse, and everybody can hear themselves so long as you're plugged into the mixer and outputting into the mains. But another cool thing is, assuming you do have your real amps, whether they be the practice ones or not, using your small amps, like your practice amps, like my little 20-watt practice amp that I would typically use just for that, practicing. You can bring that, microphone it, and amp it through the mixer and PA. So, a lot less wear and tear on your back, and you get a pretty good result, which will work fine for practicing. Another good thing is that it makes doing a recording of your live rehearsal a lot more convenient, because with just a small 2-channel sound recorder plugged into your mixer, just hit record on it, dump everything down to your stereo bus, and you're recording. Pretty quick and easy. And there's a few other reasons in there, but I think they're a little bit more esoteric. So let's move it on to the studio arena, which is really the main focus of this episode, because I think the live thing is a lot more intuitive and makes a lot more sense as to why you would need one. But in the studio, the use of mixers seems to be diminishing. And while I see why, I think a lot of times it's for the wrong reasons. That being, A, they cost money. B, people don't really know what they're used for, especially in the studio arena. So just want to talk about a few things that they can be used for in your own studio, even if it's just a small studio that you have in your bedroom, basement, attic, whatever. There's still very, very useful tools to be able to help you do a lot of things. I would say a lot easier and a lot more intuitively once you understand A, how a mixer works, and B, how to use it. Okay, so one thing I use a mixer for all the time is for headphone mixes, right? And to be able to monitor what I'm playing as I'm recording, or as I'm just playing along to things during the pre-production phase, right? So if you have even a basic 2-channel in and output interface, there is still a reason to have a mixer, even if it's a small one. And it is for headphone mixes and for being able to monitor in real time what you're playing. Because one of the huge problems I think we all face when we're recording our own music is delay. The digital age has really changed things in a great way, and I'd say for the most part for the better. But one thing I just really, really struggle with, and I'm a 15-year guitar player, musician. I played trombone, and before that, so I've been playing music for going on 25 years, and I really, really struggle when I've got a headphone mix that has delay with the instrument or vocal that I'm actively recording. So, believe it or not, there is something you can do using a mixer. Of course, there's other things, but using a mixer to make this problem go away. So one of them is, let's just use something like vocals, for example. Obviously, what we would typically do is just plug our microphone into our interface and play the music back with headphones and record. One trick you can do is just keep one headphone off so you can hear yourself, but it's just not quite the same when you hear one, like your left ear has a headphone mix going into it, and then you're listening to what you're doing in your right. It's just confusing. And not to say it can't be done. I've done it plenty of times, but I'd say it definitely leaves a lot to be desired. So you're either stuck with being kind of in a weird position where you've got one headphone off, or you can't really understand what you're listening to and actively tracking, or you have to deal with delay compensation if you want to hear yourself through the music you're tracking to, right? And once again, we're talking about vocals, but the same applies to guitars, bass, anything really. Although I'd say it's less of an issue with drums. But once again, we're talking about vocals here. So when you start hearing that delay, it can really throw off a performance, affect your pitch, and just everything. The vibe, I notice it's just not as good when you are hearing that delay. So, as insignificant and slight as it may seem, it does mess up, I'd say, most people, myself included. So, what can we do to combat that? I know, let's throw a mixer into the situation. If by using your interface, you were to send the music that you're playing back and basically recording over into a mixer, and then monitoring your active vocal take through the mixer as well, you have no delay. Not just no audible delay, there is no delay there. Now, how you do this is going to vary from one DAW to another, from one interface to another, to, perhaps even from one mixing board to another. But if you're using just a 2-channel interface, like a lot of people do, you'll have to make a slight compromise in that you've only got 2 channels that you can actively send out at one time. So what you would have to do there is send your music through, let's say, your left channel as a mono, send into the mixing board, and then take the microphone input and use your software mixer or virtual mixer that seems to come with about every interface, and have the right channel output monitor the input that the microphone is plugged into. That's a little more esoteric and not quite as intuitive, but it can be done on something as small as even a 2-channel interface. However, there are other things that you could do as well. If you're just doing pre-production work, you could simply plug your microphone into one of the XLR inputs of the mixer board itself, and then route that into the line input of your interface. Now, depending on the quality of the interface preamps versus the mixer preamps, you might be taking a loss or it might be a gain. If for whatever reason you have a small 2-channel PreSonus interface, but you have a Midas Venice board, you might actually be better off using the preamps on the Venice board anyways. But so far, those are 2 options. And then depending on what your interface is, like I personally use a PreSonus Fire Studio Project, which is an 8-channel in and output interface. But on the first 2 channels, it has sends and returns. And so what that basically does is allows me to send on channels either 1 or 2 directly after the preamp, and I can send it to either another channel or to a mixer or effects or whatever, a compressor, EQ, and I can do that before it actually hits the converters. So that gives me the option to basically continue the input before it hits the converters and split it off to another channel. While it'll still record the input after it hits the converter, it allows me to give basically a split, so to speak, if I choose to do it that way, so I can send it off to my mixing board. And that's how I personally do it. So definitely something to take into consideration if you're buying an interface, is having one that has sends on it is a pretty nice, it's definitely a nice feature that I think is worth, whatever an interface costs that has one. So those are 3 ways that you could, just by using a fairly inexpensive mixer and a fairly inexpensive interface, be able to get rid of any delay that happens from digital recording. Another thing to consider is headphone mixes. While I have an 8-channel output interface, it's not too hard to imagine that having something along the lines of a mixer just to be able to control the balance of volume in your headphone mix just at the flick of a finger on your mixing board between the vocals you're hearing and the background music you're hearing can make a very big difference. And especially if your microphone's a little bit farther away from your computer or your desk area, like I personally like to record vocals in a booth, because most of what I do is late at night and I don't want to wake up my kids. So it's pretty convenient for me to have a small mixing board inside my booth or wherever I'm recording, so that if I notice, hey, the monitor levels aren't quite right, I can adjust the volume of the whole mix, and I can adjust individual parts of the mix. And if I really was to get serious about it, I could send out stems of the drums, the bass, guitars, background vocals, and make like my own little headphone mix, like you would adjust the levels for a normal mix, so that I've got it exactly how I want to hear it when I'm tracking, which it can make a big difference when you're tracking. definitely the better the mixes that you have that you're listening to, and the better the volumes are, the better it's going to come out. But I know if I'm like recording bass guitar, I'm less concerned about the vocals and even sometimes the rhythm guitar or lead guitar. And I mostly want to hear the kick and the snare and maybe the rhythm guitar a little bit more so than anything else. But usually if I'm recording bass, I'm mostly focused on the kick and the snare. And so that's just one of those things where it's like it helps for me to turn them up at an unrealistic volume for a normal mix just so that I can follow along the groove as well as possible. And the same thing goes. I mean, everyone has their own preferences, but personally, if I'm tracking guitars, I don't feel it's necessary for me to have the vocals super loud or the bass guitar is loud, depending on what I'm doing. Once again, I like having the kick and snare a little bit louder just to make sure that I'm on beat and I'm playing along with that. And so if you're not standing close to your computer where you're recording, it's nice to just have a small mixer set up on a table or stand to where you can actively adjust the volume of your headphone mix as well as the parameters. Whether it's just one of those things where like, hey, I need to hear a little bit more highs in this for it to make sense, or you can even adjust, just in your headphones, how the EQ, you can add some compression. A lot of these mixing boards have little effects. Like my mixing board that I use for this is a Tapco. It was given to me by a friend, which was awesome. But while it's not exactly a great mixer, it does have some, not especially impressive like delay and reverb sort of effects, but they seem to help me out a lot when I'm tracking vocals just because it sounds more so how it would sound when I'm mixing it. And it doesn't sound as dry. So, and I've got it just at my fingertips, less than a foot away from me as I'm tracking vocals or guitar or whatever. And just having it there, if there's any small nuances that I think are annoying me, I don't have to get up or take off my headphones and then walk over to my mixing station where my computer and keyboard are. I can just do it right there. Okay, and so another useful implementation of a mixer is using it to route all your effects, outboard gear, other instruments, synths, guitars, to the point where you're not constantly connecting and unconnecting things from different channels on your interface. It's all right there. So all you have to do is plug in your instrument, power it on, and you're pretty much ready to go. It can be a big time saver because you can kind of just get your settings in there and kind of forget about it. It's one of those things. The less you have to go behind your interface, get behind the desk and the computer and all that good stuff, the better. Because not only are you likely to get claustrophobic, you're also much more likely to damage cables, damage ports on things. The less you have to plug in and out of things, the better. So even if you're just using the mixing board as a way to route things, that's not a bad thing at all, because worst case scenario, you mess up a port on your cheap mixing board versus your more indispensable interface. Well, I don't want to get into a bunch of specific examples of how you would use your mixing board to route things. I just think it's good to know that, hey, it is a very useful tool to basically connect things together without having to constantly move cables around and figure out how you're going to patch one piece of gear to another. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about is called analog summing. And what that is basically sending channels out from your DAW via your interface into inputs on a mixing console, and then using the console to sum them in the analog domain into a stereo file, and then send that back into the interface inputs as a stereo file. So this is something that is kind of controversial, especially if you get on the forums or anything like that, because there's a lot of people out there that say analog summing is better, it sounds better, gives you more headroom, this, that, and the other thing. And then there's a lot of people saying, yeah, it sounds better if and only if you have insert, $6,000 summing box here. And if you're using certain quality of converters and all that stuff. And obviously there's something to be said about all that, but Uh, I don't know. Try it. I personally like it. I'm not saying that I always prefer it over digital summing. And even when I am doing analog summing, I'm typically doing some level of digital summing in the DAW. So just to kind of bring this to light and make it make sense for people who perhaps have not heard of this, which is probably quite a few people, let's look at it like this. Let's say you've got something along the lines of 8 tracks of drums, all the way from overheads to kick drum to room mic. You've got 4 channels of guitars, a channel or 2 of bass, 2 or 3 channels of vocals, some keyboards, right? Basically, when you're done mixing, you click the render button and the DAW combines zeros and ones and forms a stereo file, or mono file if you prefer. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, since this is what 99% of people use, is a stereo file, right? At that point, that would be digital summing. And I think back in the early days of digital, there was a lot left to be desired as to digital summing, and especially when it would take hours and hours, whereas now it takes like a minute, depending on how fast your computer is. Reaper tends to be very, very quick about this, which is just yet another reason why I like Reaper. But I haven't tried that many other DAWs, so I'm not saying it's better. It's just what I use, and that's one thing that I happen to know it does a little bit quicker. Not necessarily better, but I'm going to say it does do it quicker than a lot of the other DAWs. So that's an example of digital summing, right? Now, the same concept applies with analog summing, except for that instead of software rendering things and combining zeros and ones together, you're basically sending the channels into a mixing board and then back into a stereo inputs, right? So the way this would look is you route all your outputs to go into whatever inputs you want on your mixing board. You assign what 2 channels on the inputs on your interface you want it to record to, and then you basically play and record the file. So, that's basically all there is to it. Yet, I think a lot of people just never get around to trying it because they don't have a board, or they fear that it's not going to make any improvement unless they spend a grand sum of money. And there might be something to be said about that, but I will say it does sound different. And in doing so, it gives you some different options, especially once you start having external compressors, EQ, and effects and other things that you can use. Heck, most mixing boards have EQ on them. So I'll say that if you start working this way, it causes you to rethink how you mix. And it kind of brings up stem mixing as clearly, if you have a 16 channel mixing board and 16 channels of output on your interface system, that's fine. That's more than enough to do what you need to do. But let's say you have 30 tracks in your DAW that you're trying to sum in the analog domain. Well, even then, you're going to be doing some level of digital summing, whether it's just taking all your guitars and putting them into a stereo bus, separating out your drums into overheads, kick, and snare, just so that you've got stereo overheads and mono kick and snare feeding into your mixing board to save on your output channels, because you just don't have enough to do all 30 something tracks in your DAW. You're still doing some level of digital summing. So not to say that just because you prefer analog summing doesn't mean you can't do digital, but even then, you're still going to likely be doing some level of digital summing. So like I said, there's a lot of debate going on there, but I think that if people try it, they may end up liking it. So let's expand even further upon analog summing, which comes into outside of the box mixing. Once again, if you look online, you'll see a lot of OTB versus ITB, which just means outside the box versus inside the box. And this is another one of those things that is super, super controversial. Okay, I would say that using a mixer there are a lot of pros and there are a lot of cons to it. One of them is that in some ways it takes longer because you have to, assign outputs and tracks to those outputs and then to the inputs, make sure the levels are where you need to be. But if you're just summing, it's not so hard. But another way to look at it is if your plan is to use your mixing board as a means of mixing, like they did back in the day and still do today, more so primarily in your bigger budget studios, it's a very viable way to work. Now, I'm talking about just a static mix here, which means you're not actively automating, moving faders, pan knobs, and adjusting EQ as you mix, which is something I'll get into at the end of the episode. But you're basically assigning your tracks to different channels of the mixing board. Now, obviously, I think most people don't have enough analog gear to be able to replicate what they do in the DAW. And that's okay. That's where hybrid mixing comes into play, which is something I do a lot of when I feel the material calls for it. If you were to listen to any of my music on Reverb Nation, you'll find that I use hybrid mixing on all of it, if memory serves me right. So what I would usually do is take software, compressors, EQs, whatever, and do whatever fixing I feel needs to be done. Like I'll usually use high-pass filters on a lot of stuff using my software. And then I'll use anything in the software I feel I need to use to kind of shape the sound, or if I plan on using some delays or some reverbs or something like that. I'll do a lot of that stuff inside the box, and then I'll route it out to my mixing board to make kind of like my final decisions when it comes to EQ, balance, and that kind of thing. And this takes, I think, a little bit more investment on your mixing board because, yes, you can do it on a cheap Behringer mixer, and I've had decent results using my cheap 8-channel Tapco mixer. But I definitely say it does leave a little bit to be desired, and different mixers have different input options, to where on the cheaper ones, you're basically forced to put it through the line inputs. Whereas if you have a slightly more expanded model of a mixing board, you can use the inserts and bypass the preamps on the mixing board, which may or may not be up to snuff. But either way, even if you do have to use the line inputs, analog summing and mixing just has its own sort of flavor and flair. And when it comes to mixing inside the box versus mixing outside of the box, I think another hobby of mine draws a pretty good analogy to it. I would say mixing inside the box is very viable and makes a lot of sense on a lot of instances. But I think mixing inside the box is a lot like cooking on a gas grill. Nothing wrong with it. It's convenient. It's quick. It doesn't impart, really any additional smell or flavor to the meat or food you're cooking. But that's just it. It doesn't really impart any extra to the flavor of what you're cooking, which can be a good or bad thing. It tends to be a lot more sterile, for better or worse. Yet, using an analog mixing board and mixing outside of the box would be more relevant and comparable to using a big smoker pit, right? Where you get this huge smoky flavor. Now, obviously, there's a little bit more work that's involved into setting up a smoker, getting the fire just right, getting everything going, adjusting things, throughout the day. But in the end result, you may or may not get a better product depending on how well you know how to use one. So not to say one is necessarily more right or better than the other, but they're just two different options. A lot of times if you're doing a very pop sounding mix, it might make more sense to do it in the box. But if you're doing more of a grunge rock album or something more folk, it might make more sense to use a mixer, just because and using more external hardware alongside with it, just because it does change the characteristics of the recorded tracks, whether it be for the better or worse, depending on the level of gear you're using. That's fine. I mean, to each their own. But that's basically the debate in a nutshell. But I think having it as an option is a very good thing because it it just gives you one more tool to use in your mixing, and also it's just plain fun. I it's kind of hard to not want to work this way once you get started. Obviously, if you have such an inferior converters in your interface and just really bad sonics and going on in your mixing board because it's cheap, old, or just not in good repair, then yeah, clearly you're not going to enjoy it. But as far as just using a mixing board to make a static mix and using it to help adjust your balance and EQ decisions, and maybe using a little reverb that the board has, assuming it's usable, it's a nice way to work, especially if you have an external stereo compressor on the mix bus. Once you take the 5 minutes or so to decide how you want to route things into the mixing board and have to make whatever compromises because you've got 30 tracks in your DAW, but only 16 on your mixing board and 16 outs, that's fine. You have to make those decisions, and there are going to be some compromises, but each song will be different. But I think if people were to try it and just see and just get a feel for the tactile feeling you get when you mix this way, and it definitely does change your decision-making process, which is really one of the big things that changes. I think when you mix outside the box versus inside the box, you just tend to mix a little bit differently, and it changes your workflow. Some people love it, some people hate it, but one of the big disadvantages to mixing this way, which I mean by mixing this way, I mean mixing using a mixing board and mixing outside the box, is the whole concept of perfect recall. If you want to change something and you've already moved all the knobs on the mixing board, if a client decides, hey, I like this, but I think that the guitars need to be a little bit bigger, even if you've taken very, very good pictures of everything, or if you have a very expensive mixing board that has recall on it, it's still going to take you at least an hour, if not more, to recall all your settings back to just where they were, especially if you're also using outboard hardware. So that's one of the big reasons why people have kind of gotten away from mixing outside of the box. Not because it necessarily sounds better or worse, but because when you start taking into consideration recall and the amount of revisions that artists are now asking for versus what they were asking for 20 years ago, it's just gotten to the point where a lot of people just don't bother with it, even if they think it sounds better, just because it's just very, very impractical when you have to do a lot of revisions. So we've talked about summing. We've elaborated on it a little bit by talking about how to make a static mix, which is basically a mix without using any automation. And by automation, I mean volume, EQ, effects, edits that change throughout the course of the mix. Now let's talk about using the mixing board for automation. Believe it or not, there was a time when the mixing process involved more than one person. Simply put, because if you wanted to make the drums louder and the guitars louder in the chorus, you had to physically adjust it in real time on the mixing board as you're bouncing it back down onto tape. If you wanted to change the panning of the guitars or backup vocals in different parts of the song, you had to actively do it. And so there is a whole like art to mixing that I think is becoming lost, and understandably so nowadays, because now we do most of us do our automation by, moving the mouse around, drawing and edit lines, adding crossfades or, simple fade ins and fade outs to make the entrances less harsh and that kind of thing. But believe it or not, it can be done using a mixing board. Now, something to take into consideration on this is the mixing board needs to be in good enough repair to where you don't have scratchy pots, or what I like to call the gremlins, to where when you move a pot or a fader, you hear this in the background, which was what I call the gremlins. Now, even if you have an older board, which I have two boards, I use a Tapco, which I now use solely just for headphone mixes and that kind of thing. And I now use my old Sun SPL 2216 mostly for analog summing and static mixes. Before then, I used that Tapco mixer to do quite a few analog mixes. And by analog mixes, I mean analog automated mixes as well. And it's one of those things that's really, really fun because after you've made your static mix, you're not done. Clearly, there are some things that make more sense to do automation on with the software and with the mouse. Like, for example, vocals. Unless you're just the world's best singer. And even then, things just sound different when they're being recorded with a magnetic strip or into a microphone. So you have to take into consideration that a lot of times the entrances of things are a little bit harsh. So if you just fade it in gradually, while it might not seem to make sense until you hear it back, I can't imagine trying to do that on an analog board. I mean, I would call that more so editing, more so than automation, but definitely there a lot of that. There are some times when it just makes more sense to do your automation in the DAW. For example, if you know that you're going to increase the volume of the vocals in the chorus and back it off a little bit in the verse, yeah, that's super simple and easy to do in the DAW. I say you have to do it that way, but I think it makes the most sense. But when it comes to automating, there's a lot more to it than just, okay, this gets louder here, that gets quieter there. If it seems like I've got some kind of harsh entrances, let me go ahead and do a little fade in on that real quick so it's not so evident and it just sounds smoother. Once again, I would call taking out the breaths, the edits, that's editing. Not so much automation, but the lines can be blurred a little bit because after you're done editing, you're basically doing automation, even though you've already done the static mix. So definitely there's editing that is done after the mixing phase, which the mixing phase should be done after editing. So the lines can be blurred a little bit, but let's just say you've got it down to where you've got let's just say 8 channels, right? You've got one vocal, and it's just a single vocal in channel 1. You've got a bass guitar on channel 2. Channels 3 and 4 are stereo guitars. Channels 5 and 6 are kick and snare respectively, and then channels 7 and 8 are overheads and room mics for your drums. So you've got basically 8 channels on your mixing board that you can automate in real time. Now, when I mean automate, little things like I've come to find that sometimes it makes a lot of sense to take your EQ on the bass drum, and every time it comes in on the first beat of the measure or something like that, depending on what the song is, you just do a quick little twist of the knob and increase it by 3 decibels every time it does that. So you're doing that actively. Let's say the verse has a real cool, heavy bass and snare line, right? And you want to just kind of just kind of kiss the bass a little bit more to give it a little bit more punch. Sure, you could spend a lot of time, playing around with compressors or automating little TP looking spikes in your automation line on the DAW, or you can just practice, see how it sounds by playing the mix and monitoring through your mixing board and listening to the changes that happen when you start playing with the EQ on different parts. So at that point, you're basically using your mixing board and you're basically playing the mix through the mixing board. And there's a lot of times where you're taking one hand and moving up, a handful of faders on one part and taking down others at the same time, or you're gradually increasing a snare drum that's gradually getting louder from a transition from the verse to the chorus, right? A lot of that kind of stuff, it just seems to work better when you're doing it in real time. And it's one of those things, have yourself a beer or two and you start practicing the mix after you've already done the static mix. At this point, you're just doing like little tweaks and edits. So you're twisting the bass, the EQ for the bass drum, and then at the same time, you're taking your guitars and kind of slowly increasing the volume, slowly taking them away. And then here comes the chorus and you turn up the highs a little bit. Okay, here comes the backup vocals. And so now you're, okay, they're great, but it just seems like they're getting muddied up in the mix. Well, you turn down the mid EQ a little bit, and then I mean, just you name it, and it gets to where like playing the mix and actively automating and doing mixing on a mixing board is almost kind of like playing a weird piano or playing a game of Bop It or something like that. And it's a really, really fun way to mix. And back in the day, people would be using these huge consoles, and they would have to get all hands on deck to do the mix. The mix wasn't something that was done, it was performed. So if you look at mixing in the analog world, using a mixing board, a mix can be performed. And so, granted, it might not be practical to do in every situation, and especially if you're working for other people where recall is going to be a big thing. But I mean, you have to just kind of know who you are and who you're working with when it comes to that kind of thing. But I'm telling you, what you can do with a mixing board that's in good repair, just by knowing when to tweak the EQ knobs and when to kind of slightly push the volume up and down, fade things in and out, and just sometimes just interesting panning things you do just by taking the stereo guitars and taking them out of hard left and hard right, and then kind of bring them to more like 50% during a bridge or a verse. It's one of those things that makes a huge difference, but it's a whole lot easier to try that stuff out actively on a mixing board than it can be by doing the tedium of going back and forth and drawing edits and in the automation line on your DAW. So it's one of those things that might not be very intuitive, but hey, just like you can punch in vocal lines on as you're tracking, you can also punch in mixes. So it's like, oh man, I got through half the song and then I just completely forgot to fade in the bass as it came in. No problem. Get about 10 seconds before that fade in comes in and start tracking and do a cross fade to bring the two sections together. It's funny, just like the way some people have to go vocals, line by line, you can also mix that way. Now, I wouldn't recommend it. That's going a bit too far, but I would say it's like, hey, if you messed up a little bit when the bridge came in, that's fine. Redo it. Just punch it in and crossfade it in at the end, and you can get a very, very cool mix that will just far surpass your original static mix just by making those little tweaks on the knobs and faders in real time. Now, once again, it takes some time to practice it. Once you've done your mix, you then have to practice performing your mix. But hey, it's just a little trick from the past, and I think is very relevant today. But just most people have never been a part of that world and never thought to do it. So to kind of sum it up, there's a lot of good reasons to use a mixing board in your studio and, of course, in the live realm. Now, whether you choose to use one is completely up to you. But if you have a mixing board, you're much more likely to see all the uses that they provide versus if you don't. Thanks for listening, guys. I'll see y'all next time.